Hey, welcome to Book World: The Great Escape. I'm author CJ Peterson. My co-host over here is author Michael Scott Clifton. We're going to be talking today about the writer's purpose, which is to persuade in our series, and we'll have one more next week left, and that's to describe. So before we jump into it, Mike, how was your weekend? Your
Oh, I had
week?
a great week. Monday, I got to speak to the Titus County retired teachers, of which I am one, and and did a presentation on the author journey, my author journey, and the books that I've written, and knew lots of people in the room. Obviously, in Titus County, we have 4 different school districts, and anyway. Sold some books and again got to talk about writing and much like we do on this podcast, and had a really good time. Our weather here has been we went from freezing cold for about a week and a half to now it's been raining every single day and foggy. So if you've ever heard the old adage, if you don't like the weather in Texas, just wait, it'll change. It's very, very true. So,
Mhm.
so right now we're, we go out, we put on our rubber boots to slosh to the cars and, get to town. So, anyway, January is not one of my more favorite months, CJ, at least around this part of the woods.
Well, I'm sure. We've been practicing our ice skating skills up here. We went from frozen pipes. They didn't burst, but they were frozen from like Saturday to like Tuesday. Thankfully, we live near the base, so we were able to take showers on base. Hallelujah. Um, we have a blessed neighbor next door who's now a friend who we were able to borrow water from because they had it. But because the pipes now go up into the attic, there's not enough insulation that they froze. And then we got them thawed out, and then we were getting ready to go to school again, and we had sheets of ice that were like almost a quarter inch thick.
Good
So
grief.
it's been fun. I finally just thawed a couple days ago, or no, yesterday. And even then, yesterday there were still like chunks of ice on the driveway where I was heading to the door of the car, the driver's side, and I had to like hold on to the car as my feet kept going past the door. So
Good
it got
grief.
fun. Like I said, practicing our ice skating skills, and that was with boots on. So like some of the other classmates of mine were saying that they had non-skid shoes and they were still flying.
Mm.
So it was fun. Thankfully, they do believe in salt up here, so it was very helpful for like the sidewalks and stuff. But yeah, no, it's fun. It's interesting. It's almost a game to see who's going to be able to stay up and who's going to land on the keister. So it gets interesting. Um, but classes are going well. I today is one of those days where I've always just felt like I was just a half second behind in everything I was doing though. It was like I was late to my second class. I was just barely made my third. I almost didn't get a seat in my fourth class. And then it's like I got here with like 5 minutes to spare before we launched today. So it's just been one of those days. I'm hoping that doesn't happen again. So
Knock on wood.
for real. So today we're going to talk about to persuade. Now, this doesn't actually land a lot with us, but it does in some zones where we talked about in regards to um, like nonfiction books and reviews. But some other forms of persuasive writing are like appeals, um, advertising campaigns, newspaper columns, and editorials, statistics, essays, debates, speech class. You have to write a speech for it. But mainly, we're going to be focusing on like the nonfiction works and reviews because you're trying to persuade somebody to potentially see something your way or instruct them so that they might follow whatever pattern you're wanting to set forth. And then for reviews, if you like the product or you like the book, you're trying to people to understand, what it meant to you and that sort of thing.
If on reviews,
Hmm.
of course, reviews are authors have a love-hate relationship with reviews. Uh,
Constructive versus destructive, we're good as far as I'm concerned.
yeah. I mean, always want reviews, but sometimes reviews are not so gentle when it comes to judging somebody's work.
Mhm.
And if anyone watching the podcast, if you're an author and you've been doing this for any length of time, you're likely to have gotten a poor review. And the reviews, the ones that, so most authors know this, especially those again that have been writing for a while. You do get the trolls
Mhm.
reviews that just go and they kind of rip your work, and you can tell if it's by the reviews themselves that they're trolls because they don't really talk about any of the content or what your story's about. They're just ripping it. And I don't get many of those, but I do get a few. I tend to ignore them. Um, but we authors, CJ, we also do reviews. We're still readers. We do reviews, and sometimes we'll do reviews for other authors who, for the books that we've read. And a good review is powerful,
Mhm.
and it can be used by authors to help push their books and sell the books that they write. And I think it's particularly incumbent upon authors to, when and if they do reviews, to make sure that they practice what they preach.
Mhm.
And don't be hypocritical about it. If you're going to give a good, honest review, and again, CJ, we both know this too. Um, we've both been on, the side of maybe a not so great review and or critique, and there's a way to be constructive in your reviews if you're being honest about what somebody has written without being cruel about it.
Mhm. A
And
lot of times I'll do like a compliment sandwich where you compliment them on something, kind of point out, hey, but you might want to adjust this, and then the compliment again, because people tend to take it a little bit easier that way. It's not fluffing their skirt or anything. It's just saying, hey, you did this really good. Might need to work on this, but this was awesome.
it struck me when of course, newspapers are kind of like brick and mortar bookstores now. They
Hmm.
are kind of slowly going the way of the dinosaur. Uh,
There are still internet newspapers
right,
and
digital.
mhm,
And I think too, if you're an author, be very careful about the type of newspaper columns that you either write or that you do editorials, because you never know whose feet you may be stepping on, whose toes you may be stepping on. Um, and so, I mean, it's people have what drives people, what are important to different folks, aren't necessarily what's important to the guy next to you or across the street. But I do think as authors, you need to be a little bit, need to be very careful about what you write um, in a newspaper column or editorial, because you may alienate the very readers that you're trying to get to read your book and your works.
mhm,
And that's not to say to be wishy-washy about it. It's just, you need to take that in consideration if you feel like you need to, to write a column or an editorial that may or may not be controversial.
mhm. For nonfiction writers, a lot of times they'll have, for example, if it's something health wise, if it's something that they're passionate about, a lot of times that comes through in their writing. When you're more passionate about whatever the subject is, people can tell, they can
Oh yeah.
see, they can feel it themselves. So I make sure to put the nonfiction works under persuade because you're trying to persuade them to understand your perspective on whatever it is that you're writing about in the nonfiction realm.
If you're if you're right, if you are writing something on a healthy diet, for
Hmm.
example, how to lose weight, the persuasion that you write in terms of what makes this particular diet, and there's a million of them out there, better than someone else's or what's already been published to a certain extent, because all diets have the same kind of uh, basically follow the same types of rules on losing weight. But when you write a nonfiction work, could be about gardening. It could about could be about exercising. It could be about losing weight. I mean, there's 1,000 different things you can write. You need to make sure that your persuasion isn't backed up by facts.
Mhm.
So just don't make stuff up out of the thin air.
But even when you're writing persuasion, it could something as simple as, a writing book, a writing aid book. So,
Oh,
for
that's true.
example, the emotional thesaurus. I love that thing. That thing is so handy. I love it and I push it. Why do I push it? Because it's very helpful and it helps people to show and not tell a little bit more. So, something that's important like that, or like a setting book. Why is setting important? Why do I need this book? You're trying to explain to them why this stuff is important. So you need to make sure that your book is not boring. You need to make sure that it is, factual. If there are certain statistics or whatever in it, make sure that you cite where they came from, stuff like that, so that, the credibility is there and it's not lost. But it, the nonfiction can vary to pretty much anything. But if it's something that you're passionate about, write it well and somebody else will push it for you.
And that passion and I guess what you're saying is that passion needs to be evident in the writing,
Hmm.
despite the fact that it may be nonfiction. And
Exactly. When it comes to persuasive writing, why are you writing it? As we've been talking about, it's to convince or move readers toward a certain point of view or opinion. Persuasive writing is a reasoned opinion supported and explained by evidence. A lot of times, if you back that stuff up, to advance knowledge or ideas in a positive way. For example, the thesaurus that I was talking about, the emotional thesaurus, helps advance, the idea of show don't tell. So, there's a prime example right there. It tries to appeal to emotion alongside factual evidence and data to support the topic that you were talking about, like some of the health books that are out there.
so, persuasive to me, part of persuasive writing, and of course, we're talking about fiction and nonfiction,
Hmm.
um, has a lot to do with the characters that one is introducing in a book, say a
Hmm.
fiction book, for example. So, if you want to create a sympathetic character that the reader is sympathetic to, then you have to convince the reader why they should be. That's part of the persuasive writing. You just can't say Jack's a great guy and leave it at that. You have to give some sort of context to that, which usually comes, through the course of the book.
Hmm.
And we've talked about these things before. An evil person, a bad guy. Uh, the person, the character who's evil in your story. Well, what makes them evil? And that's part of about the persuasive writing in making the reader, dislike the character um, because of their emotional makeup or the acts that they do. And I think that's very much a part of persuasive writing. If it's in terms of the characters that you're creating, both
Hmm.
sympathetic and non and those that you are, the bad guys, the evil
Well, and
guys.
that's a totally valid point. So when you're writing your characters in that whole show don't tell, you're not telling your reader how to feel about this character. You're showing by the actions that, are they a good person or are they not a good person? And you're able to show that through, again, the emotional thesaurus that I mentioned earlier. Um, but you're allowed to show that through the way that you write the character.
Right. And with nonfiction, for example, if you were doing a historical book, say on World War II,
Hmm.
it wouldn't be hard to find factual evidence to back up uh, the proposition that Hitler was a bad person.
Hmm.
Adolf Hitler, or in that his the World War II killed millions and millions of people. There's tons of evidence and facts that backs that up. Uh, but when you're dealing with nonfiction, even though you can introduce historical ideas, particularly if you're writing historical fiction, you still have to persuade your reader in terms of your character development and why they should care about the characters you're writing about.
Hmm. Definitely. When it comes to tips for writing, persuasive writing, that's there's actually two slides of that because there's quite a few that are out there. Choose your topic wisely. The more passionate you are about the topic, the stronger your writing will be. Just like we talk about in fiction, if there's no tears from the writer, there's no tears from the reader. If there's no laughter from the writer, there's no laughter from the reader. So it's the same thing about writing, even something as simple as nonfiction. Is your passionate evident in your writing? Have you taken the time to make sure that that's coming across? Offer credible reasoning, cite when needed. Don't plagiarize. That's a big no-no. Make sure to cite where you got the information, not just I found on the internet, blah blah blah. Figure out where it came from to begin with, and go back there and make sure not to take credit for somebody else's work. Use deliberate language. Use strong verbs and adjectives that create emotional responses like we or us. Kind of makes the listener feel part or the reader feel part of the action. When you're writing, again, regarding like the health stuff, we need to do this. If there were more of us who did this, this may happen. If you know what I'm saying, just make sure to try to get that in there. Use good examples and stories to prove your point. A lot of times, an example goes a long way because if you're trying to follow something and you don't quite get it, if you can have a relatable example to somebody else's everyday life, it makes it that much easier. Address counterpoints. When you do this, it shows you took all points into consideration. A lot of this stuff actually pertains to my speech class. Oddly enough, that I've taken this semester. So counterpoints, when you're doing a speech or when you're writing a book, you're going to want to address as many questions as the reader or the listener may have because they're going to have them. So instead of them getting to the end of the book, it's kind of like not quite finishing a fiction book where all the questions aren't answered. Get those questions answered because they need to be answered
Right.
for them to understand fully.
The first bullet point you've listed there, choose your topic wisely, I think's really important because if you're writing about something, it's either because you're, you know, you're very interested in that, maybe emotionally interested in it, or it's something that you have knowledge of. It's not something you just pull out of the air, and particularly when we're talking about nonfiction. And so, choosing a topic that you actually know something about is uh, is of course important. You'd think that would be counterintuitive, but you know we don't take anything for granted when it comes to writing. But you
And
do
don't
need
assume that the reader knows what you're talking about.
right. And I like the last bullet point too, CJ, address counterpoints, because again, particularly with nonfiction, there
Mhm.
are always two sides to an argument, um, even though one may be weaker than the other. So it's always best to try to give both sides of the coin, and then going through the bullet points we've talked about, if the writer has a certain viewpoint, then support that. But don't forget to give the counter arguments or counterpoints that in some cases will help prove the point you're trying to make as a writer.
Mhm. Definitely. A few more tips to consider. Again,
Can,
answer the
can I say
questions.
one more thing? Can we go
Sure,
back to that
sure.
last bullet point again? I think the address counterpoints, and when you said take all points into consideration,
Hmm.
I think that we, um, I think as a nation and a country, okay, a democracy cannot thrive if you don't take all points into consideration. That's what makes freedom freedom. That's what makes democracy democracy. That's where learning takes place.
Hmm.
And if all points aren't taken into consideration, then basically what you have is only one side of the story or an argument. And often those countries and nations that follow this are usually, dictatorships, or they're run by one party or one or a strong man or something like that. And so taking all points in consideration isn't just something we should be doing as writers and authors, but also whenever we're listening and trying to make decisions on the things that we do with our daily life. So anyway, I just
Mhm.
wanted to, you know, emphasize that.
So we talked about counterpoints. Another thing to consider is answer all questions your readers may have. You can ask them in the form of a rhetorical question. Those questions are out there. You might as well answer them. If not, you're going to get the email saying, "Hey, you didn't answer this." Um, include expert witnesses when possible. Find respected leaders in the field you're working in. Whatever that field is, sit down and interview with them. Hopefully, they'll have time to talk. If not, they'll know somebody who can sit down and talk with you. That's kind of the same idea when it comes to, strangely enough, fiction. When you're trying to get a perspective of, for example, in the grocery store series, I didn't know any police officers, so I had to sit down with three different ones. And I said, "Hey, give me this perspective, this perspective." She's a female officer, so I got two male perspectives because that's a little bit easier to find. But then I actually found a female one. And I said, "I need your specific perspective." So make sure to get something from somebody who's lived it and walked it. And you can get a lot more information that way, because when you write what you know or you write what somebody else knows, it takes the point across a lot more strongly. Use accurate, and I emphasize the word current, and balanced information.
Hmm.
Sometimes you can find whatever information you're wanting to. If you have this opinion, you can find tons of statistics proving this opinion if that's the one you're going for. But as you said, make sure to get the other side and make sure that they're current, because statistics change like daily, if not weekly, monthly. They change all the time. Make sure you got the most accurate, up to date information. Summarize, repeat your main point at the end, because sometimes by the time you get to the end, you're like, where was I going with this? Or your reader's like, what started this? Make sure to re-summarize it and make sure to get your points in there again. Uh, give a clear call to action. You wrote it for a reason. Make sure they know why. So when you get to the end, after you summarize, say, "Hey, so health wise, if this is what you want, start tomorrow." There's no time like starting now.
The second bullet point, which includes expert witnesses when possible, and find respected leaders in the field you're working on, which can be for both fiction and nonfiction.
Hmm.
I remember a writers' conference I was at several years ago, and one of the presenters was a content editor who specialized in historical fiction.
Hmm.
And the gentleman had, for show and tell, he had about a half dozen books. And he passed them around and said, "I want you all to look at the book covers." And of course, most of them were kind of historical romance novels, but not all of them. And he then proceeded to go through and say, "Well, this novel was based in this period or this era of time, and the discrepancies that existed in the book cover in terms of clothing or weapons and things like that that did not exist during the historical period of time the book was supposed to be set in."
Oh, that's not good.
So, so when we read that, we think, well, that's you think, for example, maybe police thrillers or something like that, forensics, which forensics that actually exist, and you're not just making stuff up in terms of evidence. But I think it includes also, it can include fiction. If you're throwing things out there that do not fit the historical time period, for example, then find somebody like this content editor, for example, or do your research
Hmm.
and determine whether or not, if you're shooting a repeating rifle in the year 1500, no, that wasn't invented until, the 1800s. So, things like that, such as that.
Yeah, my content editor caught I'd used bobby pins in 1813. They're like, nope, didn't happen yet. So I had to get a little more creative. You have to be able to catch that stuff. But this is the basic finished list for it. When it comes to persuasive writing, there's a lot of things to consider. There's a lot of aspects to look at. I'm not a nonfiction writer. So, for example, in my English comp class, we're working on nonfiction pieces. So it's a challenge for me to try to go, okay. And like I mentioned, I'm also in speech. So it's like trying to, I have to cite stuff. I have to, be accurate in everything, be current, make sure that I'm following all those steps that I just gave you in order to write a persuasive paper or in order to do a persuasive speech correctly, because you got to put your 100% behind it, whatever it is.
It seemed like, you know, again, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, so much of writing is about persuasion.
Hmm.
And it includes such a large category. And it's not just, authors that write books, just writing a letter home or writing a description on directions or something like that. Persuasive writing is a powerful tool that can be used in all different walks of life and all different types of writing. And the rules don't really differ regardless of whether it's fiction or nonfiction.
Hmm.
Um, the, the 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 rules pretty much stay the same. And the better you can write, of course, the better that you can write, the more persuasive that you will be. But and some of it, again, it seems like it's counterintuitive, CJ. Like, well, that's just common sense, right?
Hmm.
Well, not always. Sometimes we take shortcuts.
Hmm. Well, even when you mention characters, you have to write persuasive characters. Are these believable? Is this storyline believable? Is, this character doing what they're supposed to be doing in, like you mentioned, the correct time or in the correct profession? Or did they just make this stuff up? Because sometimes things are so outlandish, you just got to put the book down. I have run across that and I'm just like, oh, that's painful. Um, you have to make sure that your characters are believable. Don't follow the standard tropes. Most people are not standard tropes. They're usually a lot more complex than that. So even in the realm of fiction, make sure that they're believable because you need to persuade the reader in believing that these people are somewhat real so they'll continue to read the story.
One on my critique group, C.I. Chevron, who's a published author. Anyway, she found a couple of books. One of them was titled Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. Pride,
Mhm.
Prejudice, and Zombies.
Uh-huh.
So uh, she, she found it in a like an antique store or something like that. And there was another one she had as well, I think written by the same person, but Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies. Well, of course, we all know Pride and Prejudice. And a lot of people that read Pride and Prejudice, the description of the era and the
Mhm.
clothing and the moral values at the time and the way people acted, were pretty much on par with that period. And then you introduce zombies, Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, and
It was actually, I think, a show or a movie at one point because I remember seeing
I
that and
think
I'm
I
like,
saw a movie like that. But
yeah.
can you imagine? You think, well, that's crazy, but persuasive writing. Yeah, introduce some zombies in there, make it segue in, and make it fit. But uh, I just when you
I
were
mean,
talking
there's Frankenstein that came out of that particular time point,
right,
so who
right,
knows?
yeah, yeah. Um, it's so I just it's persuasive writing. Like I said, all sorts of different writing. It's important for all of it, and like I said, it seems counterintuitive, but I do think we often try to take shortcuts, either intentionally or unintentionally, and it messes up with it makes for the writing and the persuasion weaker.
Mhm, definitely. So this is it for this week. Again, next week we talk about the writer's purpose is to describe. We're gonna have some fun with that one. So don't forget, we're at our new time at 4 o'clock on Wednesdays. When you go to write, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, we've kind of shown that it actually applies to all of it. Make sure that you're
Mhm.
writing persuasive characters and storylines and whether it's a fiction or a nonfiction. It doesn't matter what it is, you have to make sure that you're persuasive in whatever your writing is, or somebody's just going to put your book down and you're done.
That's right.
So we'll catch you guys next week, same